Back again. I'm going to, at this point in time, I have a colleague coming in who's going to talk about salmon and the life cycles. It's actually my pleasure to introduce Ben Meyer. I've known Ben for a long, long time, and Ben is a very interesting character, interesting biologist. He has a bachelor's degree in biology and a bachelor's degree in biochemistry, and has recently been doing a lot of research on the Kenai River on the effects of global warming and the Chinook salmon, so he's kind of the expert in that area. He's completed his master's degree at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. But there's an awful lot more about Ben that's kind of interesting to know. Ben he's an expert paraglider, has traveled around the country and around South America, flying, literally and figuratively. He spent a lot of time down there. He's also spent a lot of time as a firefighter. And when I say a firefighter, a wildlands firefighter. And among the firefighters, the elite among the firefighters are the guys called the hot shots. It's kind of like, you know, the Army guys and the special forces are the elite. Well, Ben was one of those elite firefighters. He was one of the Alaskan hot shots. These are the guys that are thought of as the toughest guys in the world, and I kind of agree with that. Long ago and far away, I used to run marathons. Ben's the kind of guy that wanted to run a marathon, and so he rode his bike 30-some miles to run a marathon, ran the marathon, completed it, and then rode his bike home. This is one tough guy, and it just always impresses me, you know, his endurance and ability as a mountain climber and outdoors person. But he's also a very, very knowledgeable biologist, and I've asked him to talk about some of the aspects of salmon for us in today's presentation.
Thank you, Dave, for that very flattering introduction. Hopefully I'll stop blushing by the end of this presentation. And thank you, everyone, for being here virtually. I am thrilled to be sharing this presentation with you, who as future guides will be among the most important ambassadors and educators to our public about salmon. Since we aren't all here together today, I want to do what I can to be as accessible as possible. And we hope to hear from you after this presentation, to hear about what you loved and maybe what you didn't love. And if you have questions later on, even the summer, even beyond this Guide Academy, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll share my contact information at the end of the presentation. So yeah, I've had the privilege of working a lot of different places around Alaska as an ecologist. I was born and raised, or as we'll learn in salmon biology, spawned and reared in Wasilla, Alaska, just north of here. I've worked in both the private sector as a consultant for proposed development projects in hydroelectric and mining. I've worked for the state, for the Department of Fish and Game, and I've also worked for the University of Alaska Fairbanks mostly. Recently I finished my master's degree up there, where we were looking into some questions about what climate change potentially means for juvenile salmon habitat. I'll touch on that a little bit if we have time for our presentation. But yeah, so in these pictures I'm sharing on this slide, it's sort of a slice of life of all the different things I get to do in my work, and really this one in the lower right corner is what occupies most of my time. But don't tell anyone that most of our time is actually in front of a computer or under a pile of papers. So to start out this talk, I wanted to just share with you the idea that people and salmon have had a relationship for a long time. There's new science coming out all the time, but we've also known a lot about salmon for a long time. In this slide now, we're looking at a relief sculpture of a salmon carved into a cave in southwestern France 23,000 years ago. So 23,000 years ago, there was some human being that felt strongly enough about salmon they wanted to make some art that is still carved into the side of that cave this very day. And it wasn't really until the 1600s, though, for example, that naturalists discovered that juvenile salmon are born in fresh water, then they migrate out to the ocean, and then they migrate back to fresh water to spawn again. But even before we knew that, there were kingdoms and different governments attempting to pass laws and regulations about salmon habitat, one of the earliest on the books goes back to the 1200s in medieval England, where some of the local royalty specified that there must be a width of one pig standing sideways in the river that is left unblocked so that fish may pass. And this came to be known as the King's Gap, which I just find it a hilarious picture of someone using a pig to measure a particular distance in a river. But the point of this is that we've known a lot about salmon for a long time, even with everything that we're still learning now. A few other stats to keep in mind about salmon specific to Alaska and our modern time. Some recent surveys work has shown that 9 out of 10 Alaskans say that salmon are important to them in some way. So on this slide on the left, we have a pie chart of all these different responses to the question of how important are wild salmon to you, with about 2,000 responses altogether. And about 90% of people said that salmon are either very important or at least somewhat important. And that includes everyone. This is including people who've never touched a fish in their life, people that are commercial fishermen, maybe they're a tribal member that participates in a subsistence fishery or a personal use fisherman, and then of course, most pertinent to your job, sport fishermen. So it's important to know that there's a lot of other groups involved besides just our own. So a lot of Alaskans care about salmon, but most Alaskans, I would argue, might not know about what are some of the long-term drivers that can influence the abundance of salmon. And the way I like to frame this conversation is what some biologists call the 5 H's of salmon. And these H's are adapted from a 2003 book by David Montgomery, who's a professor at University of Washington, called King of Fish. And so these 5 H's are hydropower, hatcheries, harvest, habitat, and history. Today we're really just going to be discussing things in the frame of one of these H's, which is habitat. But it's important to know that there are a lot of things beyond our own individual knowledge and experience that influence our opportunities to catch salmon. So where do we usually see salmon? In this slide we see some guys holding a salmon that looks like they just caught. And in the other corner of the slide, we see these little baby salmon just starting to hatch out of the gravel. And I would say we know a lot less about these guys just hatching out of the gravel. So we're going to start way down there and gradually move our way up to 30,000 feet. Another point I wanted to make before we go there, though, is it's important to remember that even very intelligent people might not know about where salmon come from. I've met people that have lived in Alaska their whole life and are very experienced and intelligent, but might not know some of the things that we're going to talk about today. But here now, with your new role as a guide, you have the opportunity, and I hope the responsibility, to teach. Your work may involve showing people either their first or one of their very first experiences with a salmon, and it's really going to make an impression on them, so we want it to be a great one. In this picture, we're looking at a slide of a bunch of fish chopped up in a grocery store, and for most people, this is what they know as salmon. This is what it looks like, but you're going to be working with people that have sought out a very different type of experience with salmon. I'm going to show you another short satirical example of what people's first impression with salmon might look like. It's a short, funny commercial of a bunch of kids on a field trip in Japan to learn about where salmon comes from. So I'm just going to show it to you here. Okay, I'm going to pause our video there. So what we just saw was a group of young Japanese children seeing a bunch of little robot salmon fillets swimming by in the aquarium, already chopped up and prepped to eat, and that was what they know of salmon. That's where they come from. They're already nice little chopped up fillets. That's what they learned. That was their first thing that they learned about salmon, and we have the opportunity here to do something different. So anyways, that's the end of my soapbox part of my presentation, but let's go ahead and dive into where do salmon come from. In this slide, we are looking at a really nice illustration of all the different stages of the salmon life cycle. Starting kind of in the upper right corner, we have eggs, which then hatch out into alevin, which look like tadpoles. And at the bottom, these guys that are starting to look more like fish that some people call fry or parr. They then get ready to swim out to the ocean in the silvery form of smolt, turn into adults, and then at the end of their life, they return back to fresh water to spawn as spawners. We're going to go through each of these in more detail. Before we do that, here's a different version of that same sort of figure showing all the different stages of the life cycle, but there's all this blue text off to the side, and it's showing all of the opportunities to die along the way. There's a lot of places that salmon are not likely to survive throughout their life cycle, and we're going to talk about those in detail as well. So in this slide, we're looking at a pyramid. It's really sort of a numbers game when it comes to salmon survival. Down at the bottom, let's say, these numbers are going to vary widely for different salmon populations and different generations and different years. But let's say you start out with 2,000 eggs, next level up of the pyramid, maybe those survived only 200 fry, and maybe 10 of those survive to smolts that swim out to the ocean. 5 of those smolts in the ocean survive to adulthood, and then 3 make it back to actually spawn that didn't get caught by a fisherman or a bear. So it takes a lot of juvenile salmon to produce few adult salmon is one of the first important lessons I wanted to mention. In this picture, in the first stage of our salmon life cycle, we are seeing a bunch of eggs right along the hyphoric zone in the gravel, as Dave was mentioning earlier. So salmon are born in gravel nests at the bottom of a stream called reds, R-E-D-D. And they're the size of about a pencil eraser, slightly translucent. The eggs are usually red or pink. And during the several-month period that the eggs take to hatch, their eyes and other organs can be seen developing through that translucent egg. So things that can survive, or things that can affect the survival and development at this stage include some of the things Dave mentioned, like temperature. If you're unlucky enough to be exposed all the way, you can freeze. You can also be suffocated by sediment if there's a whole bunch of dust or soil or something that allow water to no longer flow past you, and there's not that oxygen exchange happening across the eggs. And you can also be subject to just a big flood that comes and washes you out. If there's a big pulse of water strong enough to really turn over the gravel, the eggs can wash out of that red. And in fact, there's been some recent research specific to our region for Cook Inlet Chinook that was just published this last summer by some of my friends and colleagues that showed that this particular mechanism is the one that most predicts how many adult salmon are going to return for future generations. So this process of eggs being washed out of the gravel scour is an important mechanism for Cook Inlet Chinook specifically. Fall floods can really have a big effect on likelihood of survival. And yeah, Dave touched pretty well on this idea of the hyphoric zone already. I like this illustration, so I will let you take a look at that later if you would like. So moving on to the next stage, I'm just going to play this video while I'm chatting here. We have alevin. And these guys, some people call them tadpoles because they look similar to frogs, but the technical term for salmonids is alevin. And like I mentioned, of these guys, only about 10% are actually going to hatch out from the eggs, and then only a certain number are going to survive to the next life stage after that. So one really cool thing to notice about these guys is they're swimming around with this sort of big pouch on their belly, and that is the remainder of the nutrients from the egg that they're still digesting and metabolizing, full of nutrients and fat. So the next stage after the alevin are called Parr, P-A-R-R. I'm just going to play this video while we're chatting also. So in this short video that was filmed by my friend and colleague Jason Newswanger, we see these fish are mostly holding in place. So a couple things to notice about this video that we're watching is there's a lot of structure in the background. There's a lot of leaves and roots and twigs. Juvenile salmon, Parr, really like all this structure, both for camouflage and to also reduce the speed of the current flowing in them. Another thing to notice is that this water is very clear. They're able to see what's in front of them. And being able to see what's in front of you if you're a juvenile salmon is important because what you're doing a lot of times is engaging in what's called drift feeding. So drift feeding involves holding in approximately the same position, facing upstream, and you've just got all kinds of things continuously flying at you. There's little bits of leaves and twig, little bits of dust and sediment, and once in a while there's an actual bug or an insect that you want to eat. So they're trying to distinguish between these things that are food and not food. And oftentimes they'll dash to go grab a little particle of something flying past them. And research has shown that about 3/4 of the time they'll actually just immediately spit that thing back out because it turned out not to be food. So it takes a lot of energy to engage in drift feeding, but for many species of salmon, this is what they spend a lot of time doing when they're hanging out in fresh water. In our next slide, this is kind of a figure from my own research that I was able to do on the Kenai, sort of summarizing what we found in the stomachs of a whole bunch of juvenile Chinook and coho salmon. So we have these 5 pictures of different kind of categories of food, different items you might find on the menu, and the larger items were the ones that contributed the most calories overall to their diet on average throughout the whole summer among many different types of streams. So the largest things that we see on this menu are salmon eggs, so eggs that escaped, that washed out from the red from an adult salmon that laid eggs, and also terrestrial invertebrates, so that's bugs that fell in from the land into the water, with the remaining categories being filled up by streams that are grown from within mostly from insects that are grown from within the stream itself. So the important point about this is juvenile salmon are relying a lot on subsidies for their food. So these are things that are coming in from not just within the stream itself, but coming from either the marine environment, in the case of salmon eggs, or from the terrestrial environment in terms of things that are falling in. So there's connections across this one individual place, a stream. It's actually connected to both the land and the ocean. I think that's an important point and something potentially cool to share with your clients. So after our Parr have been growing in fresh water for some time, they're eventually going to get ready to swim out to the ocean. They start to undergo a physiological change to get ready to be in salt water. And as they're moving out towards the ocean, smolt are typically facing upstream, actually. And why? It's because they're still drift feeding, so they're still having lunch on their long journey out to the ocean. And I like to call these guys silver surfers just because it kind of helps me remember what they look like. They're silvery and they're surfing the current down to the ocean. So we have a picture of the silver surfer here too. As far as when they go to the ocean, it varies by particular species and particular river. They are relying on cues both from temperature and the length of day and the volume of water flowing past the environment where they were born. The particular cue that they know and use to send themselves out to the ocean varies by the particular species and local system. So smolt start out migrating towards the ocean in kind of a big pulse, a big peak. It varies on the species and the system as to when, but sometime between May and later in the summer in Alaska is typically when smolts head out. And so in this example on this slide here, we have a bunch of out-migrating sockeye just kind of ramping up. There's a big peak in the middle of the May, and then it declines later on in June. And these guys are heading out to the estuary, or the zone where the river meets the ocean, to consume zooplankton, which we can think of kind of like their pasture to graze on. So these are the lambs starting to get fat to get sent out to the ranch. An interesting thing is if you imagine you put a whole bunch of lambs in your grazing pasture all at once, if you put in too many, they would probably just mow all the grass down to its regular nubbins and become overgrazed. Salmon managed to overcome the problem of overgrazing on too many zooplankton in the estuary all at once by spreading out the timing of their arrival. So in this slide now we see that that big peak is actually consisting of many different individual populations. In the study that this is from, they used genetic techniques to identify all the different parts of the river that these different groups of salmon were arriving from at different times. And at the bottom at this chart here, we see the populations of different types of zooplankton kind of declining as there's a whole bunch of salmon and then increasing as the amount of salmon decreases. But imagine if this peak was even narrower in Grenier, it's possible that they would just consume all the zooplankton and there'd be none left to continue regenerating. So I think it's neat how that kind of big diversity in river also produces diversity in the timing of a migratory pattern and then helps produce a kind of ecological resiliency. Something I can talk lots more about later, so I hope to chat with you further on it later. So as these guys are on their way down to the ocean, they face a whole host of predators and gauntlets. This is one of my favorite pictures of a juvenile salmon inside the mouth of a pike. This is a well-known picture among the fisheries world. If you ever see a pike in the Kenai River, we want you to notify Fish and Game as soon as possible. This is an invasive species south of the Alaska Range. If you're north of the Alaska Range, pike are a native species, but when pike are introduced to their non-native range, they can really decimate the population of salmon there. So these guys are headed out to the estuary. I just wanted to show you a beautiful picture of an estuary. And once they're on their way out to the ocean, different species and different populations tend to have a little bit different grazing grounds. They tend to travel in kind of big, wide, lazy circles around the North Pacific. And there was a whole bunch of maps that I could show you of how different species go to different areas, but this map shows 4 different pie charts kind of along the coast of the Gulf of Alaska, and the different colors represent the most common species of juvenile salmon caught in those areas. So over towards Bristol Bay, we see this dark blue color. Sockeye is the most commonly caught species, along with Somchum. As we move towards more the Gulf of Alaska area, closer to the Kenai, sockeye become more common, along with some pink. And as we move more down to southeast Alaska, Chinook become much more common. So there's these different kind of segregated grazing areas of the ocean to a certain degree. They mix up quite a bit also, but different species do have different preferences. And what are these guys eating in the ocean? Just about everything. So here's a couple features. They consume crustaceans, krill, other fish. They're known to consume different species of squid also. About 95% of the salmon's weight gain happens during the marine environment, so these guys are just eating all the time. And eventually, in somewhere between 1 to 4, even 5 years, they will grow into be an adult, like we see in this photo, and like the type of salmon that we all know and love. And here, there are even more opportunities to die. We have a picture of an orca just mowing down on some salmon here. And yeah, like I said, we're getting up to narrower portions of that pyramid I showed earlier on. More predators to come. So after growing big in the ocean, these guys are programmed to want to head home, back to spawn. So leave the grazing pasture, go back to the nursery to create the next generation of salmon. So imagine if you're out in the ocean and you got the call all of a sudden it's time to come home, but you have no landmarks, you have no trees, no roads, maps, you don't have anything to tell you where is home. How do they find their way there? There's been some really interesting research into this topic and a lot of different studies that have contributed to this knowledge. But the best information we have right now is that salmon essentially use both a map and a compass to find their way home. So by a compass, this is referring to the ocean stage when they're relying on this tiny deposit of an element called magnetite that's similar to the way a compass operates. So this magnetite is orienting to the magnetic North Pole and causing a little bit of neurosensory stimuli that tells them which direction is north and approximately where they're going to want to head back to on the coast. There's a number of other marine animals that use this technique too, such as sea turtles. But then once they're out of the marine environment and in the river, in freshwater, they instead rely more on their sense of smell to find their way back to where they were born. This is an important process to note because there are things in freshwater that can interfere with a salmon's sense of smell. For example, copper pollution is a known substance to interfere with a salmon smell, and even fairly small amounts of dissolved copper can make it difficult for them to navigate back to the place where they spawn. So there are many challenges making your way upstream, but as the salmon in this cartoon has listed, you can be eaten by a bear, caught by a fisherman, smashed to death on the rocks, but on the pro side, you only really need one thing, which is that you get to spawn. And again, there's many predators along the way here. We have a beautiful photo of a salmon being caught by an eagle. I hope you get to see something like this out there on the river. And there are many predators yet. You know, like I said, that pyramid keeps getting narrower and narrower. I'm just going to show you an example of one more type of predator in this short video here.
Driven by primordial instinct, the salmon hurl themselves upstream to spawn in the same tranquil pools where they themselves were born. Given the countless hazards of this journey, only the fittest, richest tasting red salmon make it this far. Which is why others, driven by instincts of their own, are waiting. John West endures the worst to bring you the best.
All right, so just in case you didn't catch that, that was indeed an advertisement for canned salmon. Sorry to expose you to that, but I thought the commercial was hilarious, and I hope you did too. So let's say you are a salmon that has managed to survive from one of the many thousands of eggs all the way to one of the few that gets to spawn. I'm just going to play this video while I'm chatting here. We are about to take an intimate look into the salmon bedroom of sorts and see them caught in the act. So here we have a male and a female salmon kind of sidling along each other. The male is depositing its milt sort of right next to where the female is depositing its eggs. And there's honestly kind of a big mess. Things are spilling around all over. It's not like a neat, clean process. So there's eggs rolling out, and you're about to see there's a trout that kind of sweeps in here and just has lunch on all this stuff escaping. So even, you know, before you're born, you're potentially a prey object. You will also notice there's actually a third adult salmon trying to sneak in here too. I believe this is another male that is trying to fertilize this female's eggs, and so the male is trying to kind of fend off this other male trying to sneak in, and the female is trying to sort of keep all the trout from consuming the eggs. There's a lot of challenges at this stage as well. This video goes on for a while. I'll provide you guys with a link to this presentation that you can watch the whole thing later if you would like. So once salmon have spawned, they're pretty much that is it. They're just shutting down after that. Females will tend to hold on top of their reds and guard it for as long as possible. But as soon as they spawn, essentially they start to shut down. Their immune system begins to deplete, and they are subject to tissue degradation and infection. If you're walking along a lot of places on the Kenai this summer, let's say you're on the Lower Russian, you're just going to find a place littered with dead salmon. I encourage you to try picking one up sometime and notice that it feels different from a live fresh salmon that you just caught. It's not going to be as slimy. They also stop producing this slime layer that goes along the outside of their scales that acts as kind of a protective layer. So the loss of that slime layer is one thing that makes them more prone to infection and degradation. So as you're walking along and you see all these dead bodies of salmon everywhere, someone, if they were unfamiliar with some of the processes in nature, they might think, what a waste. What are all these dead bodies good for? They should have ended up, in a fisherman's net or at least in a bear's mouth. It's too bad that they all just had to die here. But one thing that we learn in researching ecology over and over again is almost nothing gets waste. There is always energy being used by someone for something. And in this next picture here, I have a beautiful illustration of a bunch of salmon actually swimming up into a tree. So maybe that's one way you can think of it, is that all these dead bodies are actually contributing to the nutrition of many of the surrounding organisms, both within the stream and adjacent to the stream. We're getting into this topic of what we call marine-derived nutrients. And riparian ecosystems rely on marine-derived nutrients to sustain themselves. So today's dead salmon are actually help feeding the next generation of salmon. As their bodies dissolve, they help to create the nutrition that creates abundant insect populations, which juvenile salmon feed on. Freshwater is typically a nutrient-poor environment compared to the ocean, so these guys really help act as a kind of fertilizer to boost it. Elements especially like nitrogen are difficult to access in nature sometimes, and salmon are an important source of this nutrient, which can be traced using a chemical technique called stable isotope analysis, which I'll spare you from today, but is a fascinating topic. So in this short animation that's playing right now, we see a salmon starting to sort of dissolve into the stream nature, and there's a bird pecking at some bugs. There's a little mouse sort of looking for something to snack on. There's plants growing up out of the salmon. I think, oh yeah, there's a bear feeding on this body, and I think there's an eagle about to swim off with one too. Anyways, all of this waste, quote unquote waste, is not going to waste from an ecological perspective. The effect of this sort of fertilization that salmon can have on the riparian vegetation alongside stream is something that can actually be seen from space. I have a slide here where some researchers had this hypothesis that, maybe the vegetation alongside streams that have abundant salmon runs is going to be a deeper, darker, more abundant green than streams that do not have salmon runs helping contribute to this sort of fertilizing the vegetation. So they measured it from space, essentially measuring the intensity of that color of the vegetation, and there were some substantial differences. This work was done in the Columbia River down in the lower 48, sort of right along the area between Canada and Washington State, but I would suspect that there are very similar processes at work in most places where salmon live. So we have gone through the whole life cycle now. We've gone from eggs to alevin to Parr to Smolt to adult back to spawner, and we're all the way back at the same place that we started. I think that's cool that there's a whole cycle rather than just a straight line. And again, remember that not everyone knows this information, so even if you have someone that uses a lot of $1,000 words and they really know a lot about a lot of things, that they might not know some of the things that we just talked about, so don't necessarily take it for granted that they do. So a quick tour of the species that we find in the Kenai. I've outlined 5 of them here. You'll certainly know these names if you don't already by the end of your guiding season. We have Chinook or king, coho or silver, pink or humpy, chum or dog salmon, and sockeye or red. We'll talk briefly about each of these species. But before we do, I just want to make sure that you are in with this important knowledge, which is that there are actually more than just 5 species of Pacific salmon. Sometimes we hear this phrase, all 5 species of Pacific salmon, and if you want to be serious about it, which I know we all are because we're here, there are actually more than 5 species of Pacific salmon. So on this next slide, we have the 5 species of Pacific salmon I just described in the top left poster here. And then down below, we also have steelhead, which is a type of rainbow trout that is actually anadromous, or it migrates between fresh water and the ocean and back, just as salmon do. So it is referred to as a Pacific salmon species also. And if you go over towards Japan and Kamchatka, we actually have this much less common species called the Masao salmon, or cherry salmon, that tends to be this real dark red and black color. And then if you go over towards southeast Alaska, we also have coastal cutthroat trout, and many of these are anadromous also, migrating between the freshwater and marine environments. So if you want to get serious about it, there would actually be 7 species of Pacific salmon. Anyways, I'm going to move on to the next slide, where we are touching on Chinook salmon. So these are our most famed and charismatic species here in the Kenai, of course. There are 2 different sort of strains of Chinook salmon that people call either stream type or ocean type. The type we have here in the Kenai are understood to be ocean type. That is, they migrate to the sea in the first year, and they generally stay closer to the coast, return to the streams where they were born just before spawning. So if you were to go to the Yukon River, you would find some populations of juvenile Chinook salmon that actually can't make it all the way out to the ocean in their first year as a juvenile, and they would migrate part way down the Yukon in their first summer, overwinter there, and then migrate all the way out to the ocean in the following year. And there's all kinds of variations on that theme as we get into different populations of Chinook. These guys typically spend between 2 to 4 years in the ocean. Coho salmon are another important species around here. They rear in freshwater as juveniles for between 1 and 3 years. Typically spend between about 18 months at sea. There are some males who are jacks who actually only spend about 4 to 6 months at sea. They come back as much smaller adult male salmon. So jack is referring to a adult male salmon that spent a much shorter amount of time in the ocean than a normal adult salmon would. Our next species on the list here are, let me make sure I didn't skip one, are sockeye salmon. This is our most abundant species in the Kenai. They generally rear for 1 to 2 years in lakes prior to smolting. Some go straight to sea in the first year. These are the sea types. And some also will rear in river environments for at least a year before smolting. And they typically spend between 1 to 3 winters at sea. We also have chum salmon here in the Kenai. They typically go to sea just after emergence in the spring. They don't spend much time in fresh water at all. People will refer to either summer chum or fall chum. In summer chum, adults spawn earlier in the summer. Fall chum typically spawn later in the season in the fall. These guys spend between 1 and 4 winters at sea. Our last species we're going to talk about today are pink salmon. They are the least variable in terms of life history. They all head out to the ocean immediately, basically as soon as they can, as soon as they become Parr. They spend 1 winter at sea, so all of the adults that are returning are 2 years old. Have a couple other few cool life history highlights. I think for the sake of time today, I am going to save those maybe for a later question and answer session. A few pieces of basic vocabulary I wanted to touch on, though, are the terms I have listed on this page here. So this first term I've used a couple times already, which is anadromous. And anadromous means this is a type of fish that migrates from salt water to spawn in fresh water. So for example, you may hear people use this, talk about the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Anadromous Waters Catalog. This is referring to a map that the agency uses to keep track of what streams have salmon living in them and which ones may not. This is opposed to, say, catadromous species. That would be a species that migrates from fresh water to spawn in salt water. That would be like the American eels that we see over on the east coast of North America. Another term to leave you with is this idea of an escapement goal. So people talk about escapement goals when they're talking about how many fish managers are going to let swim upstream into the fishery. So this is determined through some long-term research as the ideal quantity of fish permitted by managers to spawn. People talk sometimes about this concept of overescapement. So you might have guessed from my earlier discussion about all the dead bodies of salmon actually contributing to the ecosystem. The overescapement is not necessarily an ecological concept, but it is a very important concept it is an important concept in terms of management because managers want to maximize the opportunities for people to catch fish. This last term that I really love is called portfolio effects. So portfolio effects refers to this idea that a system in aggregate, a big complicated system with many individual elements, is going to be less volatile than its individual components. So think about if you own investments, maybe you have or will have a retirement account someday. You don't want to put all of your money in just one stock or one individual type of investment. You want to spread it out between many different types of stocks and bonds and mutual funds. So that way if one goes way down, maybe at the same time there's another one going way up, and on average things are going to be more stable than if you just had one type of investment. The same goes for salmon populations. If you have a big diverse river with many different types of populations in it, on average you're likely to have a more stable number swimming out to the ocean and then swimming back up to spawn. So this idea both applies to both ecology and economics. They both share that same Latin root word eco, which means the home in Latin. That is everything that I wanted to share with you guys today. I'll just share you with a couple resources. There's a textbook I love called The Behavior and Ecology of Pacific Salmon and Trout by Dr. Thomas Quinn at University of Washington. And there's also this great free online course you can sign up for called Salmon, People, and Place. I've got the link at it down here below, and that's through an online profile called edX, but it's actually taught by University of Alaska Professor Peter Wesley, who I've had for several courses and is a great guy. You can access this presentation at this web address here, tinyurl.com/KRGA Salmon Lifecycle, and that is it for today. So thank you so much for your time. Like I said, please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions. My address is ben@kenaiwatershed.org, and I'll look forward to seeing you out on the river.